Welcome to Ghost Stories of the Battles, where history's darkest corners and the supernatural converge. In today's episode, we descend into the cold, claustrophobic depths of Hitler's bunker beneath Berlin, a site infamous for its role in the final days of the Third Reich. More than just a historical relic, this labyrinthine network of rooms and corridors is said to harbor restless spirits, lingering echoes of a crumbling regime and the weight of immense despair. What happens when the epicenter of power becomes a tomb of dread? Witnesses over the decades have recounted ghostly apparitions, disembodied voices, and an unshakable sense of unease in the bunker. Is it merely the psychological burden of history, or does this place hold spectral secrets? Let's delve into its chilling tales, but first, a brief glimpse into its grim past. Hological burden of history, or does this place hold spectral secrets? Let's delve into its chilling tales, but first, a brief glimpse into its grim pathological burden of history. Or does this place hold spectral secrets? Let's delve into its chilling tales. Located beneath Berlin, the FFR bunker was constructed in two phases, starting in 1936, as part of the Reich Chancellery's extensive underground facilities. By 1944, as Allied forces closed in on Germany, it became Adolf Hitler's primary command center. Here Hitler and his inner circle made their final, desperate decisions as the Red Army tightened its grip on the city above. In April 1945, as bombs shook Berlin and defeat became inevitable, the FFR bunker turned from a command post into a macabre sanctuary. It was here that Hitler married Eva Braun, just hours before their double suicide, sealing the bunker's infamy. The bodies of other high-ranking officials, loyalists, and their families also filled its rooms as the Reich crumbled. After the war, the Soviet Union attempted to erase the FFR bunker from history, burying its remains under rubble and later covering it with housing developments. But despite these efforts, tales of spectral encounters persist, suggesting the bunker's dark past refuses to remain buried. Story 1. The Phantom Command Room, Spring 1985. A Berlin divided. The Cold War gripped Europe, and Berlin remained a city cleaved in two, its streets echoing with the quiet tension of spies, checkpoints, and unseen conflicts. Yet beneath the modern city, another world lay buried, the ruins of Hitler's Third Reich. Decades had passed since the FFR bunker was abandoned, but its shadow loomed large in the minds of those who lived nearby. It was in this charged atmosphere that Karl Fischer, a gruff and pragmatic construction worker, found himself drawn into one of Berlin's strangest and most chilling tales. For Karl, the idea of ghosts seemed laughable. Life had taught him to focus on what was tangible: steel, concrete, and hard labor. But his beliefs would be shaken to their core when his latest job brought him face to face with the haunting legacy of the FFR bunker. The project was straightforward: clear debris from an old site near Wilhelmstrassen and prepare the ground for construction. The land was fenced off, a patch of rubble and overgrowth sandwiched between drab East German apartment blocks. Karl and his crew arrived on a crisp Monday morning, the chill in the air more biting than usual for April. Karl lit a cigarette and surveyed the site. There was nothing remarkable about it, just another job. His foreman, a wary man named Dieter, handed out assignments, barking orders as the workers unloaded tools and equipment. By mid-morning, jackhammers broke the eerie silence, shattering concrete and sending plumes of dust into the air. For the first few days, the work progressed smoothly. They uncovered remnants of walls and foundations. Nothing unusual for a city that had been bombed to ruins 40 years earlier. But Karl couldn't shake a strange feeling, one he hadn't felt on any other job. The air seemed heavier here, and the usual city noises, the hum of traffic, the distant chatter of pedestrians, felt muffled, as though the site were somehow insulated from the world above. The other workers began to notice it too. Dieter complained of headaches. One of the younger men, Jacob, joked about the place being cursed. "Maybe we're digging up Hitler's ghost," he laughed. But his nervous glance at the rubble betrayed his unease. It was on the fourth day that the excavator hit something unusual. The heavy machinery clanged against a slab of reinforced concrete, the sound reverberating through the site like a warning bell. Dieter, curious, ordered the crew to dig around the obstruction. Slowly, the shape of an old steel door emerged, its surface rusted but intact. The men gathered around, speculating about what lay beyond. Some joked about treasure, while others muttered darkly about unexploded bombs or long, forgotten horrors. Dieter, ever cautious, ordered them to leave the door alone until they could confirm it was safe. But Karl couldn't resist the pull of curiosity. That evening, as the site fell silent and the other workers dispersed, he stayed behind. The fading light cast long shadows across the rubble, and a deep chill settled over the area. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, Karl returned to the door. The door groaned open with a sound that echoed unnaturally in the stillness. Karl stepped inside, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was damp and stale, carrying a faint metallic tang that reminded him of blood. The corridor sloped downward, the walls lined with cracked tiles and faint traces of graffiti. Karl couldn't read the markings, but their angular shapes and faded black paint sent a shiver down his spine. As he moved deeper, the silence grew oppressive, broken only by the sound of his boots on the concrete floor. The corridor opened into a series of interconnected rooms, their contents long since stripped away. Yet the space felt alive, as though the air itself held its breath. Karl's flashlight revealed overturned chairs, scraps of paper too brittle to touch, and an old map pinned to the wall, its surface marred by water stains and age. Then he heard the voices. At first, they were faint, whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Karl froze, his breath catching in his throat. He strained to listen, telling himself it was just the wind or the distant echo of the city above. But the voices grew louder, distinct and overlapping, as if multiple people were arguing at once. They spoke in German, their words sharp and urgent. Though Karl couldn't make out the specifics, the tone was unmistakable. Desperation, anger, and fear. He turned, shining his flashlight into the shadows, but the rooms were empty. "Hello," he called, his voice trembling despite himself. The echoes carried his words back to him, warped and distorted. The voices stopped. Karl stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. Then, a new sound emerged. The faint clatter of boots on concrete, growing louder and closer. Following the sound, Karl stepped into a larger room. His flashlight swept across the space, revealing a long table in the center, its surface scarred and stained. Papers lay scattered across it, their edges curling with age. The faint outline of chairs, overturned and broken, marked the perimeter. At the far end of the room stood a figure. Karl's light wavered as he focused on the silhouette. A man in a military uniform, his back turned. The figure's posture was rigid, his arms gesturing as though addressing an unseen audience. Karl's mouth went dry as he tried to speak, but no sound came out. The figure turned. Its face was pale, almost translucent, the features sharp and sunken. The eyes, dark and empty, seemed to lock onto Karl's with a piercing intensity. For a brief, horrifying moment, Karl felt as though he were being pulled into those eyes, his vision tunneling and his chest tightening. Then, the figure was gone. Karl stumbled backward, his flashlight dropping to the ground and plunging the room into darkness. Scrambling to retrieve it, he turned and ran, the sound of his footsteps echoing wildly as he retraced his path through the bunker. He burst through the steel door into the open air, gasping for breath. The night was unnaturally cold, and the streets around the site were deserted. Karl didn't stop running until he reached his apartment, where he locked the door and sat trembling until dawn. Karl refused to return to the site, much to the frustration of Dieter and the rest of the crew. He offered no explanation, only a curt declaration that he was done. It wasn't until years later, during a drunken confession to a close friend, that Karl described what he had seen. His friend, a history enthusiast, showed him a photograph of Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's loyal propaganda minister. Karl turned pale, swearing it was the same man he had seen in the bunker. The site was eventually developed, the remnants of the bunker sealed and forgotten. But Karl's experience haunted him for the rest of his life. He avoided the area, claiming he could feel the bunker's presence even from blocks away. Though Karl tried to move on, he often wondered if he had been drawn to the site for a reason. Perhaps the voices and the figure were echoes of a dark past, replaying their final moments. Or perhaps the bunker, with all its history and tragedy, had become a prison not just for memories, but for souls unable to escape. The story of Karl Fischer and his encounter with the spectral figure in the command room serves as a chilling reminder of the bunker's sinister energy. But Karl's tale is far from unique. Many who venture too close to this site report experiences that defy explanation. And while Karl's account was confined to the bunker's cold, empty halls, others claim that the spirits of the F-Har bunker do not remain tethered to its underground chambers. One such story comes from a historian named Heinrich Wagner, whose investigation into the bunker's ruins in the 1990s would lead to a ghostly encounter that blurred the line between past and present. This is the story of the woman in the shadows. Story 2: The Woman in the Shadows. 1992, Berlin reunited. But haunted by the past, Berlin in the 1990s was a city in transition. The Berlin Wall had fallen, and reunification brought both hope and chaos. Streets once divided by barbed wire now hummed with the sounds of construction as East and West reconnected. Yet amidst the optimism, the scars of war and division remained visible, and some believed palpable. Heinrich Wagner was a historian specializing in the Second World War. His fascination with the F-Har bunker bordered on obsession, driven by a desire to unravel the myths surrounding its destruction. Officially, the Soviets had destroyed the site in the 1950s, but Heinrich suspected otherwise. Whispers among locals suggested that parts of the bunker still existed, buried beneath layers of rubble and secrecy. One crisp October evening, Heinrich embarked on an unauthorized exploration of a site near Wilhelmstrasse. Armed with nothing but a flashlight, a notepad, and a stubborn determination to uncover the truth, the area was quiet, almost eerily so. By day, it was a mundane stretch of residential blocks and parking lots, but at night, a strange silence seemed to settle over it. Heinrich parked his bicycle near a patch of overgrown bushes and made his way to a section of exposed rubble. The air was cool, and the faint smell of damp earth lingered. Heinrich had visited dozens of historical ruins in his career, but something about this place felt different. The shadows seemed longer, darker, as if they were watching him. He found what he was looking for, a narrow opening partially obscured by debris. Crouching, he squeezed through the gap and descended into the darkness. The underground chamber was a maze of crumbling walls and partially collapsed ceilings. Heinrich's flashlight illuminated patches of mold and rust, the remnants of a space that had been sealed off for decades. The temperature dropped noticeably as he moved deeper, and the air felt thick, heavy with an indefinable weight. As he documented his findings, noting architectural features that matched wartime blueprints of the bunker, a strange sound caught his attention. A faint whisper, so soft he wondered if it was his imagination. He paused, holding his breath, but the sound faded. Minutes later, he heard it again, this time clearer. It was a woman's voice, muffled but distinct, as though calling from a distance. "Heinrich," he muttered to himself. "You're letting the stories get to you." Determined to dismiss the noise as a trick of the mind, he pressed on, turning a corner into a narrow hallway. His flashlight beam revealed a series of broken door frames, their edges splintered as if by force. At the end of the hallway, his light caught something unusual. A faint, pale figure standing motionless in the shadows. Heinrich froze. The figure was that of a woman, her hair dark and her silhouette delicate, almost frail. She wore a dress that seemed out of place, its style reminiscent of the 1940s. "Hello," Heinrich called, his voice echoing unnaturally in the confined space. The woman turned slightly, her face obscured by shadows. She took a step forward, but instead of moving down the hallway, she seemed to glide, her feet barely touching the ground. Heinrich's pulse quickened, and his mind raced. Was she real? A trick of the light? His flashlight flickered, plunging the hallway into darkness for a moment before stabilizing. When the beam returned, the woman was gone. But Heinrich wasn't alone. A cold breath brushed against the back of his neck, and the faint sound of sobbing filled the air. He turned sharply, swinging the flashlight in all directions, but the hallway was empty. The sobbing grew louder, more anguished, and Heinrich's resolve began to crumble. Desperate for answers, Heinrich retraced his steps, hoping to find an explanation. As he reached the main chamber, the sobbing stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. Then, a faint glow appeared near one of the walls. The woman was there again, her figure faintly illuminated as though by an unseen light. This time, Heinrich could see her face. Her expression was one of profound sorrow, her eyes wide and glistening with tears. She mouthed something, but no sound came. Heinrich stepped closer, compelled by a mix of curiosity and fear. "Who are you?" he whispered. The woman's image wavered, and for a brief moment, Heinrich thought he saw another face superimposed over hers. Harder, crueler, like a mask of anger. Then she turned and walked directly into the wall, vanishing as if she had never been there. Shaken, Heinrich fled the bunker, and didn't stop until he was back in his apartment. He spent the next week researching everything he could about the bunker's history, searching for clues about the woman. One possibility stood out: Eva Braun, Hitler's long-time companion and wife for less than 24 hours before their deaths in the bunker. The descriptions matched, and Heinrich couldn't ignore the symbolic weight of her presence. Perhaps her spirit lingered, trapped by the choices that led to her tragic end. But Heinrich also considered a darker theory. The fleeting glimpse of the other face, angry, cruel, suggested that the woman wasn't Eva at all, but something else entirely. Could the bunker's energy have manifested a composite of guilt, fear, and despair, given form by decades of stories and lingering trauma? Heinrich's experience left him deeply unsettled. Though he continued his research, he never returned to the site. His story became a source of fascination among colleagues, but he rarely spoke of it in detail, fearing ridicule or worse, the resurgence of memories he couldn't fully explain. Even years later, Heinrich couldn't walk through Wilhelmstrasse without feeling a faint pull toward the site. The woman's image haunted his dreams, her sorrowful eyes pleading for something he could never quite understand. Heinrich's encounter is one of many stories that suggest her bunker's shadows are far from empty. But not all hauntings are confined to specific sites. Sometimes, the spirits of war wander far from the places they died, carrying their anguish with them. Our next story takes us from Berlin to a battlefield in the heart of France, where echoes of the First World War continue to ripple through time. This is the tale of whispers in the trenches. Heinrich Wagner's encounter with the spectral woman in the shadows paints a picture of lingering sorrow. An echo of a life lost too soon, or perhaps a manifestation of the guilt and despair that consumed her bunker's final hours. But what of those who shared its confined space during the last days of the Third Reich? Some believe the bunker spirits are not confined to single rooms or fleeting apparitions. In 2003, a documentary crew set out to explore what remained of Hitler's bunker. Their experiences revealed something far more sinister, an energy that seemed tied not to a single ghost but to the very fabric of the place itself. This is the story of the haunting of the WWII Suite. Story 3. The Haunting of the WWII Suite 2003. A documentary crew descends. By the early 2000s, Berlin had embraced its new identity as a thriving modern city. Yet its past remained an inescapable shadow. For decades, official accounts had claimed the WWII bunker was demolished. but persistent rumors of its survival lingered. A team of filmmakers, working on a documentary about Hitler's final days, received rare permission to film near the suspected remains of the bunker. The crew, led by director Martin Schexfer, consisted of seasoned professionals, people used to filming in unsettling locations. But as they approached the site, even the most skeptical among them felt the weight of history pressing down. The project's focus was to recreate the atmosphere of the bunker during its final days. The filmmakers planned to use historical footage, interviews, and modern reconstructions, but Martin insisted they include real footage of the ruins for authenticity. What they captured instead defied explanation. The entrance to the site was inconspicuous, a half-hidden shaft surrounded by modern construction. As the crew descended, the atmosphere shifted. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the air grew dense, almost suffocating. The bunker's interior was a labyrinth of decay, crumbling walls, rusted fixtures, and water stains that painted eerie patterns on the concrete. The crew set up their equipment in what they believed once Hitler's private suite. A series of interconnected rooms that had served as his living quarters during the war's final weeks. Despite the damage, certain features were still recognizable. The faint outline of where a bed might have stood, the cracked tiles of an adjoining washroom, and a section of wall where a portrait had once hung, now marked by a faint discoloration. From the beginning, the crew experienced oddities. Their equipment, reliable and well-maintained, began malfunctioning. Cameras refused to focus, audio devices picked up faint static, and batteries drained inexplicably. At first, they chalked it up to the environment. Underground interference, one technician muttered, though he couldn't explain why the same issues persisted even after moving to a different part of the bunker. The unease grew as night fell. The crew had planned a late shoot, hoping to capture the bunker's oppressive atmosphere under dim lighting. Martin instructed the team to set up for a static shot in the main suite, using only a single spotlight to cast dramatic shadows. It was during this setup that the first inexplicable event occurred. Paul, one of the cameramen, was adjusting the angle of his shot when he felt it. A hand on his shoulder. The grip was firm but cold, and for a brief moment, he assumed it was one of his colleagues. Turning, Paul saw no one. "Did you need something?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly. The others, stationed in different parts of the bunker, denied being near him. Paul tried to brush it off, but his unease was palpable. Minutes later, he noticed something even stranger, the sound of footsteps echoing in the corridor behind him. At first, the steps were faint, like someone pacing in the distance. But they grew louder, heavier, until it sounded as though boots were marching directly toward him. Paul spun around, flashlight in hand, but the corridor was empty. The footsteps stopped. The tension among the crew was mounting, but Martin insisted they push forward. "We're here to document history," he reminded them, though his own voice betrayed a hint of unease. As filming resumed, the crew focused on capturing a long, continuous shot of the suit. The camera rolled smoothly, its lens fixed on the dimly lit room. Martin and his assistant watched the live feed on a monitor, adjusting the shot as necessary. It wasn't until later, during playback, that they noticed something chilling. At the edge of the frame, a shadowy figure appeared. It was faint at first, barely more than a smudge against the wall, but it grew clearer with each passing second. The figure moved slowly, its form humanoid but distorted, as though its edges were fraying. The crew swore there had been no one in the room at the time of filming. Yet the footage was undeniable. The shadow lingered for several seconds before vanishing without a trace. As the night wore on, the oppressive atmosphere became unbearable. Several crew members reported feeling watched, their skin prickling as though unseen eyes were following their every move. It was Martin who experienced the most terrifying event. While reviewing footage alone in one of the bunker's smaller chambers, he heard a faint humming. The sound was melodic, almost soothing, but it filled him with an inexplicable dread. Turning toward the source, Martin saw a figure sitting in the corner of the room. The man was dressed in a dark suit, his posture rigid, his hands folded neatly on his lap. His face was obscured by shadow, but his presence was unmistakably menacing. The humming stopped, and the figure slowly turned its head toward Martin. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Martin felt a wave of nausea and panic. He blinked, and the figure was gone. The crew left the bunker the following morning, their nerves frayed, and their sense of purpose shaken. The footage they had captured became the centerpiece of the documentary, though Martin chose not to include the shadow figure or discuss the more supernatural aspects of their experience. Years later, Martin reflected on that night with a mix of fear and fascination. He believed the bunker's energy was a manifestation of its history, residue of despair, fear, and violence so potent it had taken on a life of its own. Others, however, speculated that the figure Martin saw was none other than Hitler himself, his spirit forever trapped in the suite where he spent his final hours. The Pfeffer Bunker, a place drenched in despair and the weight of history, is one of many sites where the echoes of war refuse to fade. But while the bunker's ghost seemed tied to its oppressive walls, not all spirits are confined by the boundaries of concrete and steel. Some roam freely across the open fields where battles were fought, their whispers carried on the wind. Our next story takes us to the battlefields of France, where the scars of World War I still mark the land. Visitors to these hallowed grounds report inexplicable sensations and encounters with what can only be described as the lingering souls of soldiers who never truly left. This is the tale of Whispers in the Trenches. Story 43. Whispers in the Trenches. The Somme Valley in northern France is a picturesque landscape of rolling fields and quaint villages. But beneath its surface lies a grim history. In 1916, this region was the site of one of World War II's bloodiest battles. Over 1 million men were killed or wounded in the months-long conflict, and the scars of the trenches remain etched into the earth. In the decades since, the Somme has become a place of pilgrimage for historians, descendants of soldiers, and those drawn by a morbid fascination with the past. Among these visitors was American traveler Rachel Meyer, whose serene walk through the battlefield one misty morning turned into an encounter she would never forget. It was late October 2012 when Rachel arrived at the Somme. A history teacher from Ohio, she had always been drawn to the stories of the Great War. Her visit to the battlefield was a deeply personal journey. Her great-grandfather had fought and survived the Somme, though he rarely spoke of it. Rachel began her walk at dawn, the mist rolling over the fields like a spectral shroud. The air was crisp, and the silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. She followed a well-worn path that wound through the preserved trenches, their jagged edges softened by time and grass. As she moved deeper into the battlefield, the feeling of peace gave way to something heavier. The air seemed to thicken, and a faint pressure settled over her chest. She chalked it up to her imagination, a reaction to the solemnity of the place. Rachel paused near a section of trench that had been partially reconstructed for visitors. She stood silently, imagining what it must have been like for the soldiers. Mud-covered, exhausted, and terrified, her fingers grazed the cold, damp earth as she leaned down to inspect the remains of an old helmet embedded in the mud. That's when she heard a faint whisper, carried on the breeze. At first, it was so soft she thought it might be the wind moving through the grass. But the sound grew clearer, the cadence unmistakably human. The words were in English, spoken in a tone of quiet desperation. "Hold the line, they're coming." Rachel froze, her breath catching in her throat. She scanned the area, but no one was nearby. The whisper came again, this time louder. "Help use." The voice was unmistakably male, but it was accompanied by another sound, the faint thud of boots on the ground, as though a group of men were running in the distance. Rachel's rational mind tried to make sense of what she was experiencing. Perhaps it was an audio installation, she reasoned, meant to enhance the visitor experience. But as the whispers continued, they grew more intense, overlapping into a chaotic murmur of voices. She felt a sudden chill, the kind that seeped into her bones. The once gentle mist now felt oppressive, clinging to her skin like icy fingers. Rachel turned, intending to head back toward the parking lot, but her path was no longer clear. The mist had thickened, transforming the familiar landscape into a disorienting maze. The once distant whispers now sounded as if they were right behind her. Don't let them through. They're all gone. Help me. Rachel spun around, her heart pounding, and caught a glimpse of something through the fog. A figure, barely visible, dressed in a tattered military uniform. His face was obscured, but his posture was one of exhaustion and despair. Before she could call out, the figure faded into the mist. Panicked, Rachel quickened her pace, her boots crunching against the uneven ground. She stumbled upon a depression in the earth, a shell hole, its edges softened by years of erosion. The moment she stepped near it, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, a void that pressed against her ears. And then, as if pulled by an unseen force, Rachel felt compelled to step closer. Peering into the shell hole, she saw nothing but mud and grass. Yet a sense of overwhelming dread washed over her. It was as if the ground itself pulsed with sorrow, a deep, unrelenting grief that brought tears to her eyes. Suddenly, the whispers returned, but this time, they weren't distant. They were right next to her. Why didn't you save us? Rachel staggered backward, her chest tightening as the voices grew louder and more accusatory. She turned and ran, not caring about the direction, desperate to escape the unseen presence that seemed to cling to her every step. After what felt like an eternity, Rachel stumbled out of the mist and onto the edge of a paved road. The whispers ceased, and the air felt lighter, though the chill in her bones remained. She glanced back at the battlefield, half expecting to see the figure from the mist watching her. Instead, she saw only the empty trenches, their jagged lines cutting through the landscape like old scars. Rachel hurried to her car, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the keys. As she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had intruded on something sacred. A place where the dead were still fighting their battles, unseen but not unheard. Rachel's encounter stayed with her, haunting her dreams and coloring her perspective on the war. When she shared her experience with colleagues, most dismissed it as a combination of stress and an overactive imagination. But a few nodded knowingly, sharing their own tales of strange sensations and unexplained phenomena on the battlefields of France. Years later, Rachel returned to the Somme, this time with a small group of students. As they stood near the trenches, one of the students turned to her and said, "Did you hear that? Someone was whispering." Rachel smiled faintly but said nothing. Some places, she realized, never stopped speaking, even after a century of silence. From the trenches of the Somme to the ruins of Berlin, the echoes of war remind us of the pain and sacrifice etched into the fabric of history. These battlefields are more than just places. They are living memorials, haunted by the souls of those who gave everything and whose stories still beg to be told. What do you think? Are these encounters mere tricks of the mind, or are they proof that the past never truly dies? Share your thoughts, and join us next time on Ghost Stories of the Battles. From the ghostly whispers in the trenches of the Somme to the haunted chambers of Hitler's bunker beneath Berlin, these stories offer a chilling reminder of war's enduring scars. They aren't just eerie tales meant to frighten or entertain. They are echoes of a history steeped in pain, loss, and sacrifice. Each of these haunted sites tells a story that history books often fail to capture: the personal cost of war. The bunkers, trenches, and battlefields stand as physical reminders of the horrors humanity is capable of, but the ghostly encounters within them suggest that the emotional weight of these events lingers long, after the final shot is fired. When we walk through these places today, it's easy to see them as relics, mere artifacts of history. Yet for those who fought, lived, and died in these spaces, they were the center of their world, moments frozen in time by fear, desperation, and courage. Perhaps it's not surprising that some spirits remain. Could it be that they are bound by unfinished business, desperate to be heard? Or are these places so charged with emotional energy that they have become imprints of the past, replaying fragments of their darkest hours like an unending loop? Consider the bunker where Adolf Hitler spent his final days. The air of paranoia and despair that gripped its inhabitants must have been suffocating. Carl Fischer's encounter with the phantom figure could be seen as an echo of this despair, a spectral reminder of lives spent in service to a destructive ideology. Or think of the trenches of the Somme. Over 1 million men died or were wounded in that landscape, their suffering woven into the very soil. Rachel Meyer's experience with the whispers and ghostly figures wasn't just a haunting. It was a reminder of the voices that were silenced, soldiers who may never have had the chance to tell their stories. One common thread runs through all these talus: war leaves a mark not just on the living, but on the places where it is fought. Whether we interpret these hauntings as literal spirits or as manifestations of a collective memory, they compel us to confront the darker chapters of human history. When we encounter these stories, we're forced to ask difficult questions. What drives humanity to such extremes? What can we do to ensure we honor the sacrifices of the past and prevent future generations from experiencing the same horrors? Perhaps these ghostly encounters are the spirits' way of demanding remembrance. They call out to us, asking that we don't forget the lessons of their suffering. And in doing so, they ensure that the past remains alive, not just as a warning, but as a guide for how we might shape a better future. As we leave these stories behind, one question lingers: are the ghosts of war tied to these places, or are they carried within us all, whispering in the quiet moments, reminding us of what has been lost? Thank you for joining us on this journey through haunted history. If you've experienced anything similar on a battlefield, share your story in the comments below. Until next time, remember, history isn't always in the past. Sometimes it's waiting just beneath the surface, ready to reach out.